There's a photograph that exists in the Hollow Creek County archives that no one is allowed to check out. It shows 6 children standing in front of a farmhouse in 1984, their faces blank, their clothes outdated by nearly 40 years. When authorities found them, the youngest couldn't speak, the oldest wouldn't. And when investigators finally pieced together who they were, they discovered something that made the case files go quiet for decades. These children weren't the first ones to vanish from that property. They were just the first ones to come back. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the spring of 1984, a utility worker named Dennis Cramwell was reading meters along County Road 14 in rural Pennsylvania when he noticed something wrong with the Hollow Creek property. The mailbox was overflowing. The grass had grown waist-high, and there were children's faces in the upstairs windows, watching him, not moving, just watching. When he called the sheriff's department, he told the dispatcher he'd seen at least 4 kids, maybe more, staring down at him like they'd never seen another human being before. The deputies arrived within the hour, expecting a welfare check. What they found instead was a scene that would haunt every officer present for the rest of their lives. 6 children, aged 4 to 15, living alone in a house that had been abandoned for over 3 decades. No adults, no records, no explanation. The children spoke in whispers and seemed terrified of sunlight. They flinched when doors opened, and when asked where their parents were, the oldest girl said something that froze everyone in the room. She said, "They're downstairs, waiting." The house itself was a relic. Built in 1923 by a family named Merrick, it had passed through several owners before being seized by the county in 1951 for unpaid taxes. According to public records, it had sat empty ever since. No electricity had been billed to the address in 33 years, no water service, no gas. Yet when deputies entered that day in April of 1984, they found evidence that someone had been living there, carefully and quietly, for a very long time. There were candles melted down to nubs on every surface, hand-pumped water in wooden buckets, a root cellar stocked with preserved foods in jars so old the labels had turned to dust, and in the kitchen, a calendar on the wall, hand-drawn, marking off days that went back years. The children were malnourished but not starving, pale but not sick. They wore clothing that looked handmade, stitched together from old curtains and linens found in the house. Their hair had been cut with what appeared to be kitchen shears. When deputies tried to approach them, the younger ones huddled behind the older girl, a 15-year-old named Rebecca, though they would not learn her name for days. She stood between the officers and her siblings with a kind of fierce, feral protectiveness. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stared, as if calculating whether these men were more dangerous than whatever she'd been protecting her family from. When the sheriff asked where the adults were, Rebecca repeated what she'd said before. "They're downstairs." The deputies exchanged glances. There was no basement visible from the main floor, but Rebecca walked to a corner of the kitchen and pulled aside a rug, revealing a wooden hatch built flush with the floorboards. The hinges were old iron, rusted but still functional. One of the deputies, a man named Carl Woodward, would later tell a journalist that the moment he saw that hatch, he felt a cold certainty settle over him. He knew, without knowing how, that whatever was down there had been waiting a long time to be found. When they lifted the hatch, the smell hit them first. Earth and decay and something else. Something sweet and wrong. The beam from their flashlights caught the edges of wooden steps descending into darkness, and at the bottom, barely visible, were shapes that didn't belong. The basement wasn't on any blueprint. It had been dug by hand, sometime long ago, its walls shored up with timber and stone. The ceiling was low enough that the deputies had to crouch as they descended. The air was thick, almost solid, and their flashlights revealed a space roughly 20 feet across, circular, like a well that had been widened. Along the walls were shelves carved into the earth itself, and on those shelves sat dozens of jars, preserves, pickles, vegetables, suspended in brine. but it was what sat on the floor that made Carl Woodward radio for the state police. There were 3 wooden chairs arranged in a half-circle, facing the stairs, and sitting in those chairs were the remains of 2 adults and 1 child. They had been dead for years, perhaps decades. The bodies had mummified in the cool, dry air of the basement, their skin pulled tight over bone, their clothes rotted into rags. But they had been positioned carefully, their hands folded in their laps, their heads tilted slightly forward, as if in prayer or sleep. And between them, on the ground, was a 4th shape, smaller, wrapped in what appeared to be a quilt. When the coroner later examined the remains, he determined they were a family, a man, a woman, a boy around 8 years old, and an infant. The adult male showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. The woman and the boy had no visible injuries, but toxicology tests would later suggest poison. The infant had simply stopped breathing. But here's where the story fractures into something darker. The bodies were identified as the Dunhill family, reported missing in 1947. Herbert Dunhill, his wife Margaret, their son Samuel, and their infant daughter Grace. They had lived on the Hollow Creek property briefly before vanishing without a trace. Local newspapers at the time speculated they'd fled debts or started fresh somewhere out west. No investigation was ever launched. The case, if you could even call it that, went cold within weeks. But here they were, 37 years later, arranged like an audience in a hand-dug crypt beneath a house that had supposedly been empty since 1951. And the children upstairs, the 6 living children who had been found just hours earlier, could not possibly have been born to the Dunhills. The math didn't work. The eldest girl, Rebecca, was 15 in 1984. That meant she'd been born in 1969, 18 years after the house was abandoned, 22 years after the Dunhills disappeared. For 3 weeks, the children barely spoke. They were taken to a county facility in Harrisburg, separated for medical evaluations and psychiatric assessments. Doctors found them physically healthy despite years of apparent neglect. Their teeth were surprisingly intact. Their bones showed no signs of rickets or malnutrition-related damage. But psychologically, they were unlike anything the state had ever processed. They did not play. They did not laugh. When left alone, they would sit in perfect stillness, hands folded, staring at nothing. They refused to eat unless all 6 of them were together at the same table. And at night, they would wake simultaneously, as if responding to a sound no one else could hear. Rebecca, the eldest, became their voice. But only after a child psychologist named Dr. Miriam Holt spent hours sitting with her in silence, simply being present, asking nothing. One afternoon in early May, Rebecca finally spoke. She said her mother's name was Caroline. Her father's name was Joseph. She had 4 brothers and 1 sister. They had lived in the house for as long as she could remember. They had never gone to school, never seen a doctor, never left the property. When Dr. Holt asked why, Rebecca looked at her with an expression that the doctor would later describe as ancient. She said, "Because they told us not to." Over the following weeks, Rebecca slowly revealed pieces of a story so strange and disturbing that investigators weren't sure whether to believe her or refer her for long-term psychiatric care. She said her mother and father had taught them to read using old books found in the house. They had taught them to grow food in a hidden garden behind the tree line. They had taught them to stay quiet, to move only at night, to never light a fire that could be seen from the road. And they had taught them about the people downstairs, the ones who were waiting. Rebecca said her father told her those people had lived in the house before them, that they had made a mistake, that they had tried to leave, and the house wouldn't let them. When Dr. Holt pressed her on what that meant, Rebecca went silent for 2 days. When she finally spoke again, she said something that appeared in the sealed case files but was never made public. She said her father told her the house was older than the Dunhills, older than the Merricks, that families had been coming to Hollow Creek for over 100 years, and that some of them stayed longer than they should have. She said her father believed the land itself remembered everyone who tried to leave, and that it didn't like being abandoned. State investigators began digging into the property's history, and what they found suggested Rebecca's story, as impossible as it sounded. had roots in something real. The Hollow Creek property had been owned by 7 different families between 1872 and 1951. On average, each family stayed less than 5 years. Most left suddenly. Several left behind furniture, livestock, and personal belongings, as if they'd fled in the middle of the night. But 3 families never left at all. They simply vanished. The first were the Laws family in 1893. Parents and 4 children. Gone. No bodies. No evidence of foul play. The second were the Pritchards in 1918, a couple and their newborn son. Reported missing by a relative who came to visit and found the house empty, the front door wide open, and a meal still sitting on the table. The third were the Dunhills in 1947. Until 1984, no one had known what had happened to them. But now, with their remains discovered in that basement, investigators began to wonder if the others were down there too. A full excavation of the property was ordered in June of 1984. Cadaver dogs were brought in, ground-penetrating radar, forensic teams with shovels and sifting screens. They tore up the yard, the barn, the tree line, and they found nothing. No additional graves, no hidden remains, just the Dunhills, still sitting in their chairs beneath the kitchen floor. But they did find something else. In the attic, hidden beneath rotted insulation, was a wooden trunk. Inside were journals, dozens of them, written by different hands, spanning over a century. The earliest entry was dated August of 1874, penned by a man named Amos Holloway. He wrote about hearing voices in the walls at night, about his children waking up screaming, claiming someone was standing at the foot of their bed, about his wife refusing to go into the basement, saying it felt wrong, like stepping into a mouth. The last entry in his journal was a single sentence, written in a shaking hand. It said, "We are staying. It will not let us go. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" The other journals followed similar patterns. Families describing strange occurrences, isolation, paranoia, and then, abruptly, the writing would stop. But one journal stood out. It belonged to a woman named Caroline Derry, and it was dated 1967 to 1983. This was Rebecca's mother. Her entries were calm at first, almost mundane. Recipes, weather observations, notes about her children's progress in reading and math. But as the years went on, the tone shifted. She wrote about her husband Joseph becoming obsessed with the basement, about him spending hours down there, talking to the chairs, about him insisting they could never leave, because leaving meant joining them. Here's where the case becomes something else entirely. When investigators tried to identify Caroline and Joseph Derry, they hit a wall. There were no birth certificates, no marriage license, no social security numbers, no record of them ever existing. The children had no birth certificates either. They were ghosts, legally speaking. People who had lived and breathed and raised 6 children in complete invisibility. The state launched a nationwide search using dental records, fingerprints, and DNA, hoping to match the children to missing persons reports. Nothing came back. It was as if Rebecca and her siblings had materialized out of nowhere. But then a retired detective named Louise Hargrove, who had been following the case in the newspapers, came forward with a theory that changed everything. She had worked missing persons in Philadelphia during the 1960s and 70s, and she remembered 2 cases that had never been solved. In 1966, a pregnant 16-year-old girl named Caroline Schaefer had disappeared from a group home in Chester County. She was 8 months along, unmarked, with no family willing to claim her. In 1965, a young man named Joseph Kern had walked away from a psychiatric facility in Allentown, where he'd been held after a breakdown. He'd been diagnosed with severe dissociative episodes and paranoid delusions. He was 19 years old. Both cases went nowhere. 2 damaged kids, lost in the system, assumed to be runaways who'd either died or moved on. Louise believed Caroline and Joseph had found each other somehow, that they'd ended up at Hollow Creek, maybe by accident, maybe by design, that they'd hidden there, raised their children there, and spiraled into something dark and unrecoverable. The DNA tests eventually confirmed her theory. Caroline Derry was Caroline Schaefer. Joseph Derry was Joseph Kern, two broken teenagers who had disappeared into the woods of Pennsylvania and built a family in a house that had already swallowed others before them. But here's what haunted Louise, and what haunts everyone who studies this case. Caroline's journal entries from the final years suggest she knew exactly what was happening. She wrote about Joseph's belief that the house demanded something, that it fed on isolation and fear, that the Dunhills hadn't died by accident. They had been kept, preserved, as a warning or a promise. In her last entry, dated March of 1983, Caroline wrote this: "Joseph says we have to stay. He says if we leave, we'll end up like them. But I think we already are like them. I think we've been dead for years and just didn't notice." 3 months later, Caroline and Joseph Derry were found in the woods half a mile from the house. They had hanged themselves from the same tree, side by side, their hands tied together with a length of rope. The autopsies revealed they'd been dead for roughly a year before the children were discovered, which means Rebecca, at 14 years old, had kept her siblings alive in that house, alone, for 12 months, never leaving, never asking for help, doing exactly what her parents had taught her to do: stay quiet, stay hidden, and whatever you do, don't let the house know you want to leave. The 6 children were eventually placed into foster care, separated across 3 counties. The state deemed it best for their psychological recovery. Rebecca fought it. She told Dr. Holt that splitting them up was a mistake, that they needed to stay together, that something bad would happen if they didn't. No one listened. Within 2 years, 4 of the 6 children were dead. The youngest, a boy named Thomas, drowned in a foster family's pond in 1985. He had been afraid of water his entire life and never went near it, until the day he walked into it and didn't come back out. A girl named Sarah died in a house fire in 1986. The fire started in her bedroom while she slept. Investigators found no accelerants, no faulty wiring, just a girl who burned while the rest of the house remained untouched. 2 of the brothers, Michael and Daniel, died together in 1987. They had been placed in separate homes nearly 60 miles apart and hadn't seen each other in over a year. On the same night, at nearly the same hour, both boys stopped breathing in their sleep. No medical explanation, no signs of distress. Autopsies revealed nothing. They simply stopped. The only 2 who survived were Rebecca and her sister Anne. Rebecca, who had tried to keep them all together, and Anne, who had stopped speaking entirely after they were separated. They were never placed in the same home. The state wouldn't allow it. The Hollow Creek property was seized again and put up for auction in 1986. No one bid. It sat empty for 8 years before the county finally bulldozed the house in 1994. They filled in the basement, paved over the foundation, and let the woods reclaim the land. Today, there's nothing there, just trees and silence. But locals still avoid County Road 14 after dark. They say if you stop your car near where the house used to be and roll down your windows, you can hear children whispering, not playing, not laughing, just whispering, like they're trying to tell you something you're not supposed to know. Rebecca Derry, if that was ever really her name, disappeared from state custody in 1992. She was 23 years old. She walked out of a supervised apartment in Pittsburgh and never came back. Some believe she went looking for her sister. Others think she went back to Hollow Creek. A hiker reported seeing a young woman standing in the woods near the old property line in 1993, just standing there in the rain, staring at the ground where the house used to be. When he called out to her, she turned and walked into the trees. He said she moved like she knew exactly where she was going. Ann Derry lived until 2008. She never spoke again after leaving Hollow Creek. She worked as a cleaner, lived alone, and died of a stroke at 39. In her apartment, investigators found a single photograph tucked into a Bible. It showed 6 children standing in front of a farmhouse, their faces blank, their clothes strange and out of time. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were 6 names and 6 dates. The dates were all in the future. Thomas, 1985, Sarah, 1986, Michael and Daniel, 1987. Rebecca, 1993. And at the bottom, her own name, Anne, 2008. She had known. Somehow, she had always known. The case files were sealed in 2012 under a court order no one has been able to explain. The photograph that started this story, the one in the Hollow Creek County archives, is still there. You still can't check it out. And if you ask the archivist why, she'll tell you the same thing she tells everyone. Because some things are meant to stay buried, and some families were never meant to leave.